Thanks for joining us at Stand to Reason. I am J. Warner Wallace, sitting in for Greg Koukl, which I do occasionally, but it's been a while since I've had a chance to do that. So just glad to be with you, glad to join you. And if you want to call in and ask a question after our opening comments, please do that at 855-243-9975. 855-243-9975. And if you're calling internationally, that is 562-424-8229. If you send your question to the website, you don't have to wait for us to call you back. You can call in live right now. We've got people lined up already asking questions. I'm glad to be able to talk about some things that matter. The stuff that Greg talks about on occasion here makes it this is his bread and butter, right? This is a place where you come for a thoughtful view of Christianity, and I want to help you advance that cause at least a little bit. And by the way, before I jump right in, let me just tell you, I'm excited about the Reality Conference this year. It starts in September of this year. We start a new season in which we're doing something called Chaos to Clarity. And I want you to go to realityapologetics.com and get all the details. We're at 5 locations this year. This is only growing, so please join us. This year's theme is Chaos to Clarity. You'll be blessed by the opportunity to go. And it's about students, right? But if you're somebody who loves students, bring yours. And that's what I see when we do reality conferences, is that something different is happening. You know, people get excited about going to a conference, a Christian conference, to learn something. But people who bring students to reality are more than just interested. They're actually concerned about the future of the next generation, and they are engaged in the process of training up the next generation. So when they come, they have a slightly different attitude about what it is we are doing at a conference. They understand that we are really training students for the next generation to be able to understand what is true and how to defend it in a culture that is becoming more and more hostile to the Christian claims. So I think you will get something out of reality that you don't get out of other conferences. And if you've not ever been to a reality conference, don't let this year go by. We're in Seattle, we're in Atlanta, we're in Dallas, we're in Minneapolis, we're in Costa Mesa here in Southern California. We're all over the country this year, so please find a way to join us. And we see people drive like from 5, 6 hours, 10 hours, they'll drive to get to us. It is worth the drive. I'm looking forward to seeing you at this year's reality conferences. Okay, now let's just jump in. We'll have questions here in a few minutes, but I wanted to start with a couple of issues that are important to me, and maybe I'm the only one because this is my weird background, but I as you know, I had an entire career as a police officer, and I felt like it was some of the best stuff I ever did in my life I did while employed and working cold case homicides. And I felt like this was a calling, and if you'd have asked me this for years, I would have said, yeah, I feel like this is a calling. And if you don't see it as a calling, you probably shouldn't be in law enforcement. But for the first 8 to 10 years, I was not aware of who the caller was. I would have said it was a calling, but I wouldn't have been able to probably lock down or give you a definitive idea of who the caller was. And I think really knowing who the caller is, becoming a Christian, changes the way you see the world, of course, and it changes the way the police officers see the world. So what I want to talk about in this first segment is just some observations, especially in a culture right now which is more and more hostile to law enforcement. We think it's hostile to Christians. We have seen, no one's, at least at this point, suggesting a defunding of Christians. Okay, of course they probably would have it silenced and canceled, but there's actually a bigger call to cancel and defund police. And I know that expression can sometimes be taken in the wrong way. People will say, well, they don't really mean defund, they really mean to reallocate funds. Well, I always say, well, definitions matter. Greg says this all the time, definitions matter. So if you don't mean defunding, don't use that term defunding. Use the term reallocating funds. We want to reallocate funds toward other. By the way, the process of reallocating funds toward different resources within the law enforcement umbrella is another way of saying reform. But when I was hearing the call for defunding the police, it wasn't a call for reform. As a matter of fact, they were making the statement that the law enforcement couldn't be reformed. It needed to be defunded. And at least the initial calls were for the complete defunding of police. Now, I know that sounds crazy to a lot of us, but I think part of it is because that people don't understand what it is we do and what the struggles are. And really, is this kind of job that you could ask a human to do and not have a high degree of error and not have all the biases and prejudices that we have? Look, the claim sometimes is the reason why I bring this up is I get emails all the time from young Christians. I just got one this week, asking the question, can I be a Christian and a police officer at the same time? I mean, is that possible? I've got friends and family members who say that, no, if I'm a police officer, I'm probably going to have to do something that violates my conscience as a Christian. And I thought to myself, look, I wasn't a Christian for the first 8 or 9 years that I was a police officer. But I never saw any, and I was a Christian for that entire remaining time. Yes, is it possible to be a Christian who acts on his beliefs and tries to be consistent with his beliefs and actions as a Christian and also be a police officer? I think, yeah, I did it. And my son's doing it now. But what are the challenges that we face that would lead someone to think, well, I'm not sure you could do both those things? I mean, is it possible that a view in which law enforcement is a priority or it becomes your career, is that so contrary to the Christian worldview that you can't do both at the same time? Well, I think that, first of all, there's a sense in which, that question assumes that we are doing something nefarious that is a total violation of the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. And if we became Christians, we'd have to stop doing that stuff. Well, what does he think we're doing? And that's part of the problem. I get it, that we get a picture as painted of an entire group of 800,000 to a million law enforcement officers in the United States based on the behavior of a few of us. And by the way, this has been happening for years and years. My dad was deployed during the Watt summer riots in the 60s. He was deployed because of behavior that he was not involved in, that he had to go keep the peace for the behavior of somebody else. And I get it. We were not an LAPD. We weren't even in that jurisdiction where we had to go and they deployed us there because, and here we are, as police officers, discouraged, he was discouraged, having to keep the peace for something that he didn't think he was responsible for. Every agency operates slightly differently. And in California and Los Angeles Basin, there's over 30 municipal law enforcement agencies with all their own tactics, training. There is some general training from post-certification, for sure, in California. But if you're in a different agency, just across the street, if you're in a different agency, there will be different protocols. So you can't lump us all together. We're not that similar, okay? And in my generation, I was deployed on the Rodney King. And here we are again, deployed, discouraged by the way that we look, the perception the public has of us, knowing that we weren't responsible for that. We're just being deployed to the area where somebody else did this. It wasn't me. It wasn't us. But of course, wearing a uniform, I'm going to be judged as though I was that person. And now my son is having the exact same experience. Third generation of Jim Wallace is working in law enforcement, being deployed after George Floyd. And discouraged because we feel like, hey, this isn't me. I would never do something like that. Yet I have to keep the peace in an area and be judged as though I am part of a larger group that apparently does this stuff. No, it's not true. As a matter of fact, you can live very consistently. Now, the biggest question is going to be, I think, for most people who ask that question, can you be a police officer and also be a Christian, is this idea of force. Can we use force? Can we use even deadly force as a Christian? Aren't Christians supposed to be pacifists? Now, I'm not going to go into all the details on that, but I have written about it at coldcasechristianity.com and at a new website which we've written just for police officers called thethinbluelife.com. And we talk about this in terms of, am I committed to a pacifist position if I claim Jesus of Nazareth as Lord, if I am a Jesus follower? And I don't think that's the case. I think there are, from Old Testament through the New Testament, there are several situations in which the use of force, up to and including deadly force, is allowable. For example, to protect your own life. This starts in the Old Testament. It's in Exodus. There are certain Levitical laws that talk about this. You can protect yourself from an attack, and you can use whatever force is necessary to repel the deadly attack, up to and including deadly force. And that would not be considered a murder. That would be considered a homicide, the death of a human, but it would not be considered a homicide for an unjustified homicide or a malicious homicide, which is the definition of murder. So I think that is the kind of thing we have to keep. And also, there's another situation. If you are somebody who is trying to protect the life of an innocent, if you're trying to stop a school shooting in which kids are being shot, and before the sixth kid is shot, you step in and use whatever force is necessary, up to and including deadly force, to stop the mass attack on innocent people, you're not going to be charged with a murder. That's a homicide, but it's a justifiable homicide because protecting yourself and defending the life of an innocent are biblical principles for justified homicides. And this is what police have to make a decision when they encounter any force scenario. Are those two justifications present that would allow, and if you're holding a theistic position as a Christian, you have to wrestle with those same issues. But look, before we jump off this topic, I just want to say that there are struggles that we have as police officers. There are certain unique features of law enforcement that cause us to have to think deeply about issues that otherwise you wouldn't think about. Now, I do think that the Christian worldview actually assists us. Not only do I think it's possible to be a Christian and a police officer, I think that some of the things that you're seeing, or if you're somebody who's against the law enforcement community in your community, the law enforcement agency in your community, it's probably because you're seeing behavior that would be addressed and even modified and corrected by those who are on the agency if they held a Christian worldview. Give me a couple of things that are a struggle for police officers. You have two directives every shift that you have to struggle to navigate. The first directive and the first objective in calling it is that you have to be able to lay your life down. Are you willing to give up your life to protect your community? That's what we sign on to do. And that means that we'll be in a situation sometimes where we're going to have to make a decision about whether we're willing to give up our life to save the community or to protect the community. Now, so we have to have a certain amount of selflessness and sacrifice. At the same time, the second directive is that you want to get home alive at the end of the shift. That's just natural, an instinct, right? You want to be able to come home. You can't help anybody tomorrow if you don't get home tonight. So these two things are in direct opposition, though. The impulse that causes police officers to run toward the problem is in direct opposition to the impulse that says, hey, protect yourself. You want to go home at the end of the shift. So we're constantly looking at situations and trying to decide, how do I best take care of this and protect my community, but at the same time get home at the end of the shift? And we have milliseconds to make these decisions, and they are difficult to make. A Christian worldview that can help you. If you hold a Christian worldview, you have a certain amount of courage about what happens after you die that will give you a sense of peace in working a shift. Otherwise, I think you'd be anxious, wondering if this shift is going to be... Everyone who dies on duty does not realize when they close the door in that police unit and they go 10-8 for the start of the shift, and they get on their radio and they log in on their computer and they go 10-8. They don't know at that moment that this is the last time they will ever do that. And if you struggle with that and anxiety about what is the long term, like what am I here to do? What am I called to do? And what is the nature of life? Is it really about the 90 years I get on planet Earth, or is there something that transcends that? It is harder to work in this job. Another thing we struggle with is this nature of mercy and justice. As Christians, we know that God personifies the absolute perfect balance of mercy and justice. And it seems like the scriptures call us to constantly wrestle to get that right in our own lives. Times when we need to be more merciful, and where that's directed in the scriptures, or times when we need to be more just and more discerning and call out heresy and guard the sheep and do those things that are really from the justice side. Trying to strike the perfect balance between justice and mercy is one of the hardest things to do as a Christian, but Christianity informs the process. I don't even think a lot of officers think about that relationship between justice and mercy. We're doing it all the time, by the way. You pull somebody over, it's discretionary. Do I write a ticket? Do I give them a warning? I got choices to make here. Am I going to side on the side of mercy or the side of justice? Somebody now is getting a little froggy at a call and they're starting to push on you, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, now's the time. Do I side on the side of mercy? And do I side on the side of justice? These are questions we have to make in every shift. And it turns out the Christian worldview, if you think about the nature of God and what's written in Scripture, it'll at least help you to recognize that is the struggle, right, between justice and mercy. So there's another way that Christianity informs your worldview as a police officer. I'll give you another way that it does. I always say this, that in order to survive, especially working horrific homicides where you're called out and the victims are in every category of young people, babies, all kinds of things you don't want to see, you don't want to be involved in, you don't want to bring this home for sure. What you learn to do as a mechanism is you learn to ratchet down the circle. I always say it this way, there's a circle of people. It's smaller and smaller as you get to do this job the longer you do it. A circle of people for whom you are willing to cry. In other words, there's a lot of people that are outside that circle that I'm just not going to cry about. And what I mean is, what's in that circle as a police officer after maybe the first 5 or 6 years was basically your immediate family, your wife and your kids. And my dog was in that circle. My cat was not in that circle, okay? So there's a circle that you kind of ratchet down. And if you're outside that circle, I can't break a tear for you because I can't do my job. If I encounter somebody in the field, I've had cases where young kids were the victims of assault or the victims of a murder. And is it worth a tear to be shed? Yes, but you can't do that. They have to be outside that circle. Because if you have them inside the circle, number one, you're not going to be able to work the case. Number two, you're going to bring it home. And you're going to be a mess for the rest of your life. You'll be ineffective. So what officers do is we have a tendency to ratchet down the circle of people for whom we are willing to cry. And that means, and by the way, Christianity is, what kind of person does that result in? I mean, what kind of person, at the end of 20 years of doing that, you can be pretty hard and pretty hard-end. Now, how do we solve that problem? If you encounter people like this in the field who have been doing the job for a long time, you will find that those officers are pretty hard. And it's not like they started off that way. This is a mechanism they use to survive. But Christianity is calling us to always open the circle. So there are people we have to be empathetic toward. Empathy is not something that serves you well if you're working homicides all the time, because you'd be crying about everything. Instead, you have a more detached view. This is a case, not a human. Now, that's not a view that I want to have. And Christianity helps me, informs me how to... I could see, though, why some officers, after a period of time, would have the tendency to dehumanize victims, dehumanize suspects, dehumanize a lot of people, because they don't have a constant call and the Holy Spirit guiding them toward opening up their circle. By the way, there's another aspect of that circle I'll just get briefly with you, and that is that I always say this, if you assume up front when you're talking to people that everyone is a liar, well, then you're probably going to get to the truth faster than you are if you assume that everyone's telling you the truth. As a matter of fact, when we train with people and we train new recruits and they come out in the street, they have a tendency to believe everybody. Their interviews are terrible. They get schnookered by people who we know as we're watching them as the FTO, this guy's being lied to. Yet the kid doesn't know because he's trusting everyone. At some point, skepticism is your friend as an investigator, because it has the potential at least to lead you to the truth. If you believe everything that everyone says, you're just going to be the guy that everyone lies to. So that skill set of just being skeptical about everything, do you think that works well when you're pulling people over, when you're talking to innocent people? No, it doesn't work well. So how do you break the tendency to want to be skeptical and bitter and tired of being lied to? How do you break that? Well, it turns out the Christian worldview speaks to all of this. If you're concerned that in your agency where you live that there's an issue with racism, well, Christianity speaks to that. If you're concerned there's an issue with the lack of empathy, well, Christianity speaks to that. Whatever your concerns are, it turns out that if you hold an informed worldview that you express in your daily actions as a police officer, you're actually going to be a better police officer. So is it possible to do your job as a police officer and be a Christian? Yeah, it's possible. As a matter of fact, I think it could be a better one. And that's why we started this thinbluelife.com project, because we knew that part of the bigger solutions to what's happening in culture is that more officers need to know Jesus. And that's what we're trying to do there. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll take some phone calls from Craig and Nancy and others who are on the line and waiting to take calls. Thanks so much for calling. Remember, the number here is 855-243-9975. And if you're calling internationally, it's 562-424-8229. We'll be right back here in a few minutes to Stand to Reason. Thanks so much for joining us back here at Stand to Reason. I'm Jay Warner Wallace, sitting in for Greg Koukl. Thanks so much for being patient with my technology. As we're sitting here doing this, I'm amazed that I'm actually able to do this from my house. Kyle is sitting there with him patiently trying to tell me, you're making a fool of yourself because you have a mute button on, and so I luckily figured out how to do that. So, but thanks for joining us and being patient with that. And I want to remind you before we go to calls, I don't know if you know that we've got a university at Stand to Reason. And it's been there for a little while. It's at training.str.org. And we've got exclusive free courses from the STR guys, from Greg, from Al, and I should not call him Al, and from Tim. And each one of these are short. They're easy to access. They're easy to understand. I just want to encourage you, for example, all the stuff that Greg talks about and teaches with tactics, it's all available at the training section of the website. That's at www.training.str.org. Okay. That being the case, let's go to Craig first, and we'll talk a little bit about Mormonism. Thanks, Craig. How are you, bud?
Wow, doing all right. How about yourself?
I'm doing okay. What's your question about Mormonism?
Well, yeah, actually kind of need I guess probably the best way to title probably a primer in Mormonese. Been meeting past couple of weeks or so with a couple of missionaries and good kids and everything. And when I started meeting with them, I asked them right up front because, they wanted to share the plan of salvation with me. And I said, now, this truth that you're sharing with me, is this a 2 + 2 = 4 kind of truth, or is this a chocolate versus vanilla kind of truth? had to explain to them what I meant by that, but they said, oh, it's a 2 + 2 = 4. I said, great.
Good.
So I asked them, I said, so when the Book of Mormon contradicts what the Bible says, or the Bible contradicts what the Book of Mormon says, how do you know who to listen to? And they're like, well, they don't. I said, they're complementary. I said, well, let's take a look at something. So I went to, the Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, by grace you're saved, and all that. And then the second Nephi 25, 23, by grace you're saved after all you can do. And I said, those are two mutually exclusive statements. There is no harmonizing with that. And so we're going back and forth, with different verses and all that, and then the yeah buts and the what ifs, and basically ended up getting nowhere with them. And so this Friday I'm going to be meeting with what's probably going to be my last meeting with them. And what they said before I left in this last meeting was, pray about the Book of Mormon to see if it's true. So, well, I've heard that. And I said, okay, it's a pretty big book. Is there anything in specific you want me to pray about? And he said, yeah, there's something there's called the Book of Enos, E-N-O-S. I said, okay, yeah, whatever. Okay. So I actually have a Book of Mormon, and I started reading it. I was really kind of floored because the whole point that they were trying to make of being able to spend eternity with Heavenly Father in the celestial kingdom was dependent on all this grace and faith, plus all these works and ordinances and yada, yada, yada. And then in this Book of Enos, in this verse 8, it basically, I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but anyway, this Enos guy was basically convicted of his sin in a similar manner that King David was. And he was broken and crushed under it and contrite and everything. And he cried out to the Lord day and night for a few days. And it says that the Lord said that your sin and guilt was swept away. And he says, how can it be? And he says, quote, because of thy faith in Christ, whom thou hast never seen before, seen or heard, many years past before he shall manifest himself in the flesh. Wherefore, go to, thy faith hath made thee whole. And unless I'm wrong, that's the same formula that applied to Abraham that got him justified.
Right.
And so really, I was wanting to show this to them, but I wanted to use their vernacular to explain to them that what they had me pray over and read is the exact same thing that Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 says.
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple of approaches here, and we've got another call from Nancy in Thousand Oaks about how do we bring a Mormon to Jesus. So I'm just going to try to wrap and answer her question as I'm answering yours too, Craig.
Okay.
You're absolutely right that part of the problem is in terminology, right? We have to define these things. We can easily talk past each other because we use the same words, but they have different meanings. You already know that. You know that when you talk about Jesus, you're describing a very different entity, a very different being than we are when we're talking to Mormons about talking about Jesus. We believe Jesus is God by his very nature. They believe that Jesus is a man by his nature, but he becomes God through good works. So there's a very different understanding of who Jesus is. This is true for every word that is used by a Mormon missionary who comes to your door. This is true when they talk about heaven. What do they mean by heaven? What do they mean by salvation? What do they mean by eternity? What do they mean by God the Father? What do they mean by the Holy Spirit? What do they mean by baptism? These are all things that have their own specific definitions under Mormonism. This is why I don't usually, and a couple of things. Let me say this first of all. I know there's a sense in which, and I felt this way when I first started. I mean, the reason why we started working with Mormons was because I had that background in my family. I have 6 brothers and sisters who were all raised, half brothers and sisters, all raised LDS, and my stepmother was LDS and still is. And so I thought, I'm interested in this. And when I first became interested in God, my sister got me interested in the Book of Mormon. I think it is important then to recognize what the limits are, because you'll get disappointed. I thought, I discovered that Mormonism is not true. As I was discovering that Christianity was true, it's the same process I took to examine Christianity, I used to examine Mormonism. And so I was eager to share it with my Mormon family. Like, look, when you discover what I've discovered, surely you're going to say, okay, enough of this. Well, no, actually, it turns out in all the years I've spent working with Mormon missionaries, working with believing Mormons in Salt Lake City and Provo, at BYU, we really have never, you very seldom ever see somebody like light bulb go on, and what you see is a process for everyone who comes out of Mormonism that traces back years and years. So if you do meet an ex-Mormon who happens to become a Christian, and by the way, most of them don't. Most of them are kind of, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on you. This is
right.
But typically they don't trust any version of Jesus after they leave the Mormon version of Jesus, and they usually become atheists. But if you do meet somebody who comes out of Mormonism and becomes a Christian, they'll usually tell you it starts like a long time ago. Like, oh yeah, my brother-in-law was talking about this 10 years ago, and he said this. I kind of stewed on it for a while, and then like 5 years ago this happened, and then 3 years ago this happened, and then a year ago that happened. And so you're playing this game of baseball where you're just kind of moving people along the base path, and it takes a number of years to get there. And I get to be ready. What you're doing with on Friday is going to be helpful and going to be useful, even though you probably won't see it. Because they're not going to come out like in that the first time they've encountered. And by the way, missionaries encounter objectors like us all the time. They're expected. They don't expect you to they expect the opposition. And so when they get it, they're very patient with it. They're like, yeah, this is what unsaved people are like. They object to the gospel of Mormonism because they're unsaved and not regenerate, and they basically have excuses for why you are the way you are when they are the way they are. So it's going to be tough. So I typically, though, won't do this. I typically won't say, well, okay, so you start off by saying, well, Book of Mormon says X and the Bible says Y. Which one of those two do you believe? And they said, well, they're going to say, what they just said, that there's no contradiction. And you're going to say, well, let me show you where there's a contradiction. And then there's going to be debates about, how to parse out why that really isn't a contradiction. I start a little bit different. And this will maybe help Nancy with the same question. My question is generally, tell me why I should trust the Book of Mormon. Period. I'm not going to compare it to the Bible yet.
I actually asked them that on some other missionaries that asked me to do the same thing. I says, how do you know that this is true? I said, oh, because we prayed about it and had a burning in the bosom. I said, okay, well, feelings can lead you astray. And if I pray about it and I say it's not true, now what?
Well, and by the way, this is one thing I'm going to tell you, and anyone who works with Mormons, is we have to be genuine enough. So they'll typically say, read the Book of Mormon and pray about it. And they'll offer a testimony about how they read the Book of Mormon and prayed about it, and they had an experience that justified it was true. Now, I wanted to make sure that I did what they asked, because if you want to be taken seriously, so I want to know the Book of... So my Book of Mormon sitting behind me on the shelves here is completely redlined with all the notes. You can't open any page in the Book of Mormon is not that big. When you add it to the Doctrines and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, you have a pretty thick volume. But the Book of Mormon itself, and by and large, you will find that the Book of Mormon agrees much more consistently with Christianity than Doctrines and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price, because Joseph's theology evolved over the years, and his first text is the Book of Mormon. So there's a lot in the Book of Mormon. You would say, wow, it doesn't even sound like Joseph agrees with Joseph, because here in the Book of Mormon he sounds like a Christian, but later on he sounds completely different. And Doctrines and Covenants, for example. And that's because his theology evolved over time. So it's not a hard read. That's what you won't probably ever find someone who will tell you, hey, read Doctrines and Covenants and pray about it. No, they're not going to say that, because that's not going to sound or feel like Christianity. But the Book of Mormon sometimes does.
And trying to do the same thing.
Right. So what's really great is that you want to be able to read the Book of Mormon from cover to cover. You don't need to go through the entire quad. You don't need to go through, obviously, the Old and New Testament. You don't need to go through Doctrines and Covenants and Pearl of Great Price. But if you read through the Book of Mormon, and lucky for me, is that I actually wasn't sure if Christianity was true, and I wasn't sure if Mormonism was true, but I had an incentive to join the second group, because I had a lot of family members who were Mormons. I had none that were Christian. So I was like, hey, if this is true, I'm in. The problem was it wasn't. But I did read through it, and I prayed about it, because I wanted to know. And this was what was being told to me by missionaries. Read it and pray about it. And let me tell you what happened. I continue to read. And when I tell my testimony to Mormons, I don't really have a testimony like this, but if I say, well, here's my story, is I prayed about this. I read the Book of Mormon. And I can probably cite you where you are. If you're in Alamo, wherever you might be in the Book of Mormon, I can probably go there with you. I've read it. You can see my notes. So I've definitely studied this. 2, I prayed about it. And let me tell you how I think God answered my prayer. God led me to continue reading. And when I got to the Book of Abraham, I knew it wasn't true. And because God led me there. If you know the history of the Book of Abraham, you know why. the Book of Abraham, is demonstrably false. You know, that we have the parchment, we have the people. They'll say, "Oh, you're missing the most significant." Not actually, because the drawings that Joseph included in the Book of Abraham are still on the papyrus that we discovered in New York. So we have the papyrus that Joseph used to translate the Book of Abraham, and we know that it does not say anything, including the images that he put in the Book of Abraham and said, "This is what these images say. This is what these hieroglyphics say." Well, we still have those images on the original papyrus, and guess what? They don't say what Joseph said they said. So we already know that he's a false translator on the Book of Abraham. And that's what kept me out of Mormonism. It's really, you know, you could argue, well, look, you got some anachronistic problems in the Book of Mormon. You've got no archaeological support for the Book of Mormon. Bigger problem is we know Joseph is not telling us the truth in the Book of Abraham. So why should we trust he's telling us the truth in the Book of Mormon? So what kept me out of Mormonism was the Book of Abraham in the Pearl of Great Price. And by the way, if you go out, and I've been to BYU, and I've sat at the feet of some of the best, John Tvedtnes was one of the best Mormon apologists around at the time. And he wrote an entire volume on the Book of Abraham. And their explanations for the problem of the papyrus are lame at best. I mean, a lot of them will default to, well, it's a spiritual translation. In other words, if God had if Joseph had found a phone book, the Yellow Pages, and he had been inspired by God, it would come out looking like something else. It would come out looking like the Book of Mormon, maybe, because it doesn't mean that he's translating it in the way that you and I would translate one language to another. This is a spiritual translation in which God gave him the words, so you can't compare the manuscript to the papyrus anymore because it was inspiration of God that told Joseph to change all the words. That is one of the defenses that scholars actually use to defend the Book of Abraham. So I think in the end, my bigger question is always, it's all about authority. I didn't think I could trust the gospel authors in the New Testament. So I tested them to see if they were trustworthy. If I'm going to trust Joseph, I'm going to have to test Joseph to see if he is trustworthy. And like any prophet, in Deuteronomy 18, is the minute you're wrong about one prophecy, you are not to be feared, according to Moses. And he's wrong about a bunch of prophecies, but more importantly, he's written an entire book that is not what is on the papyrus. So in the end, that's what kept me away from Mormonism. Now, look, I just say that. In other words, I just share my testimony as somebody who wanted Mormonism to be true, who read the Book of Mormon, hopefully, and who then prayed about it and felt that God led me to keep reading. God answered my prayer. It's just that it ended up falsifying the Book of Mormon rather than verifying. Now, what they'll typically say is, well, no, you never should have read any further than the Book of Mormon. We didn't ask you to do that. We asked you to read the Book of Mormon and pray about it. You actually tested God. You should never test God. That's what they'll say. So in the end, I'm willing to leave it there. Thanks, guys. I totally understand. Okay, I'm glad. I just wanted you to hear my testimony. I wanted you to hear. I wanted to hear your testimony, and now I want you to hear my testimony, and we'll have to leave it there. Now, that is the little kind of, like Greg always talks about, the stone in the shoe, that will become part of a 10-year story for the Mormon who may eventually come to faith in Jesus. So you just have to kind of leave it there. And what I don't want to do is, I think what happens is we get frustrated that everything we say, they've got a canned response. Well, yeah, they've been in the field for 2 years talking to Christians door to door. You don't think they're ready for everything you're going to say? That's why they put a senior missionary with a new missionary. They don't put two new missionaries together. Because they've got senior guys they've listened to all these arguments for a year. They're ready to respond to those. They've been in meetings sometimes with people at the door where they had to bring a bishop because they got a little bit feisty. They know how to respond to all of this. But when you're kind and you just offer it from the perspective of, I read it, I prayed about it, here's my testimony, that's the kind of stone that stays in their shoe. And that's basically where I leave it.
Yeah. Now, I guess you kind of partly answered part of it there in the sense that with what you just told me about the Book of Abraham, how well versed is the average garden variety missionary in the Book of Abraham and the problems that you're talking about? Is that something that they know about and they don't?
Well, what's great about it is, I think that's probably happening more. But when I first started doing this, 15 years ago, they would go Book of Abraham, but they've never even read the Book of Abraham. They never thought about it. They never went that far with it. And so it's a good opening salvo. It's a good place for them to start, right? You leave them with something they can research. And you can actually seed that field a little bit. Because I knew when I went through this and I was looking for what is the Mormon response. There's only two kinds of Mormon response. The first Mormon response is, well, we found the papyrus, the original papyrus, but it's missing significant chunks. Well, that doesn't really work because the illustrations that Joseph puts in his Book of Abraham are still in the existing papyrus. So at least we have part of the papyrus that he was translating from. We know that at least. And number two, there are Egyptian hieroglyphics in the illustrations themselves that Joseph mistranslated. So it's going to be hard to avoid the fact that he's mistranslating. Okay. The other defense, and this is why there's a second defense from Mormon scholars, is that we have the part of that papyrus, but Joseph is conducting a spiritual translation. So the reason why there's a spiritual translation defense from Mormon scholars is because they know they can't get around the first one, which is that we're missing but you'll still see this online. People will say, oh, we don't even have that original papyrus. They haven't investigated it. So I always say, look, before you go any further, before you invest your life in this, wouldn't you at least like to know what both sides say about the papyrus from which Joseph translated the Book of Abraham? You should at least be aware of that. I think there's enough scholarly discussion back and forth on this that it should cast some doubt in most people who have not been familiar with the Book of Abraham. And so I think that's a good place to start. And let that be, again, it'll just end up being that one story. You'll never see these folks again. But it'll be one story. They'll say, 20 years ago, I was on a mission field, and some guy mentioned the Book of Abraham, and it's been bugging me ever since. But look, a lot of the reason why Mormons are Mormons is because they have a lifestyle connected to this, a lifestyle of family and employment and a history,
Right.
and they are privileged enough to be able to go. If they made a decision to go on their mission, they have a certain commitment level to Mormonism that's higher than probably a lot of people have today to Christianity. And so that level of commitment keeps them in, right? So you're not just fighting against a is it true kind of a thing. You're fighting about, is it beautiful? Does it make my life beautiful? Is it my family the way it is because of this? Is my community the way it is because of this? Is the girl I just met somebody who's in a part of this system? I mean, there's a lot of reasons that will keep you in the system, even though you are having doubts about it. As a matter of fact, I think when they poll most men who are in Mormonism, they're more skeptical than their wives, but it's useful, right? Especially if you're working in places like Salt Lake City as a Christian evangelist on the streets of Salt Lake City. It's going to be harder, I think, to make the case there. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And that you're going kind of like where I thought it would end up. I just need to place a good sized rock in their shoe, because I did the last time, and actually I think the Holy Spirit got to I think it was the junior one, because he was rather quiet and he listened. The other one was kind of the more and more I would present something, more and more he would blow up, and either deflect it, deny it, or change the topic, or what have you. And so,
well, my spirit with these folks, and we'll take a break here in a second, but my spirit with these folks has always been, Craig, that I wanted this to be true. I wished it was true, because I would have joined my family. It hasn't. The fact that it's not true has just only caused more division. But it's not true, and I wish it was true. But you can test it, like a police officer tests any other statement from a witness. And then I start sharing but I don't even think I have to go that far. I honestly think that if you just have a spirit that introduces them to the truth of why you're not in, well, then that's enough. And then let them investigate the rest on their own. But I want them to go away thinking, well, yeah, he wasn't trying to club me with this. He wasn't trying to convert me to Christianity. He was just sharing his testimony about why he's not a Mormon. That is a much more powerful approach, I think, because it doesn't feel like it's aggressive. It feels like it's more conversational. And it doesn't feel like, hey, my goal when you walk the door, you open that door, my goal is to either to beat you with the stick or to convert you to Christianity. And well, no, actually it isn't. But I'm going to tell you, this is the reason why I'm not doing, why I'm not letting my kids do what you guys do, because this is my own investigation, right? So anyway, let's take a break for this. Thanks so much, Craig, for calling in. I appreciate you so much. We'll take a quick break, come back, and finish up this hour here at Stand to Reason. All right, back here at Stand to Reason. Thanks so much for bearing with us through. Hey, I hit the mute button, didn't I, Kyle? So you should be happy with me. I actually did it properly this time, so that's good. By the way, remember, if you haven't been to any of the events that the guys that speak at here at Stand to Reason, Greg's got one coming up at Stonegate Church, and I think it's in Midlothian, Texas. That's why it's typed on my screen here. But you can get more information at stonegate.church, www.stonegate.church. That should give you more information. He'll be there on June 27th, so that's coming up here just this weekend. So that'd be awesome if you could join him there. All right, let's go back and we'll just take, I know that Nancy had a kind of a closing question on the Mormonism. We might as well finish out this little bit of our hour answering that question as well. So Nancy, what can I do to help you?
Thank you for having me. But
Yeah.
I have 3 little questions besides reading the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
But I want to say I have a nice, very nice chiropractor. So it's different from 2 Mormons coming your door. So how do I bring him to Jesus? And the other question is, what book do you instead of along with the Book of Mormon? What book would you suggest? And I've heard I think it's the last verse in Revelation that says, you can't use another book.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple questions. Tell me, Nancy, how did you know that your chiropractor was LDS?
Oh yeah, his family is from Utah, and he's he's never said that, but I know he is.
Okay, so you don't have a natural conversation about issues of faith for the most part, then, right?
We haven't yet.
Okay, got it.
But
Okay, so Nancy, what can I ask you a question?
Sure.
The kind of injury you're in there for your chiropractor, I think this leads to questions about our lives and about the temporal nature of our lives. Whenever I'm in a doctor's office, for the most part, we go to a doctor's office because we're trying to extend the quality of life, right? And those, I think, can lead to questions and conversations about the quality of life. And so I always start conversations the way I learned from my friend named James Picardo, who wrote a book called Unsilenced. I don't think it's even available. I think it was either a self-published book at one time. I don't even think it's available anymore. But he was great because he was the kind of guy who would start conversations by asking the same question, just phrased in slightly different ways. And that question was usually, what do you think happens when you die? What do you think happens when you die? And so in this context, it might be, wow, do you ever see patients here that are here because they're really injured to the point where they might be like life-threatening injuries? I mean, do you ever see those kinds of things? He might say yes or no. Well, the next question I would say, well, what do you think happens when you die?
Yes.
That's a good question, right? And you as the patient are asking that. I mean, a lot of folks, I've got a friend who's in a chiropractic office who's a Christian, and he feels, he's not able to kind of, if somebody asks him a question, well, then of course he can engage in that conversation. But I don't think his boss would ever be comfortable with him initiating the question. Now we can talk about whether that's good or bad or how you can get around that. But the point is, in this context, you be the patient asking the question of the chiropractor or the question of the technician. You be asking that question, and I think and especially if he's raised in LDS, and he probably would be happy to engage that question with you.
Yeah.
And one of the things I always ask about now, of course, remember, Mormonism is changing. So, for example, if you were to encounter, before Mitt Romney ran for president, if you were to encounter a Mormonism and talk about the difference between Mormonism and Christianity, they would tell you, their prophet would tell you, no, we're not Christians. We believe that the church, that Christianity needed to be restored. And that's what Joseph came to do. He came to restore the church that was lost after the death of the disciples, the death of the apostles. The plain and precious truths were lost. And Joseph restores those in his work with the Book of Mormon. And so they would have said there's a difference. They would have said, no, we're not Christians. Today, you might find that people would say, well, actually, no, we are Christians. They see themselves as a denomination of Christian, and they are far more likely to adapt their views, especially if they're not they don't know much about, for example, their own history. If they haven't parsed through everything that Joseph Smith ever wrote. Sometimes as apologists, we do more time studying what Joseph wrote than people who are just lay people who go to wards in Mormonism. So we know a little bit more, that we have to kind of educate them on their own history. What did Brigham Young say about this? What did Joseph say about that? And so you end up having to educate them on what it is their church teaches theologically, because they're not even aware of it. They've kind of embraced the teaching of Christianity and wrapped it into their view of Mormonism. So it's
Right.
a little harder now to talk about this than it has been, say, before Mitt Romney ran for president. Because let's face it, a lot of Christians would not vote for Mitt Romney in the first run. And unless you can convince Christians that Mormonism is the same as Christianity, you're not likely to get them, especially if Christians feel as though Mormonism is preying on Christian belief in order to grow its numbers. Because let's face it, the most people who come to faith in Mormonism are Christians that are confused, and it's really hard. Mormonism doesn't do nearly as well converting atheists as it does converting Christians. So that if you see this as kind of predatory, then you're not likely to vote for a Mormon. You think it's heretical. You're voting for a heretic who holds what you believe is a disparaging view of your Savior. So I can see why it would be hard, right, to get elected under that large body of people. But if you can convince us that you're just another sect of or another denomination of Mormonism, you've got a better chance, right? Okay, that being said, if you have this conversation with your chiropractor and you ask this question, what do you think happens when you die? You're going to find that his answers might sound a lot like Christian answers. I sometimes will ask the question, if you died, if he says, I think I'm going to be in heaven with Heavenly Father, I'm going to be, and of course, remember, what is heaven to Mormons is different than what heaven is to you. You believe that heaven is the highest offering that God holds for you in the next life. But this is not true under Mormonism. Heaven's divided into three kingdoms, right? The celestial kingdom is the highest level, so you have to really be specific. To be at the highest offering of God in the next life under Mormonism means you are exalted as a God in the celestial kingdom, which is different than you just going to heaven with God under Christianity. It's very different. But I always ask the question, if you died right now, do you know with certainty that you'll be in celestial kingdom? I always put it this way, with Heavenly Father. Because most Mormons, at least 15 years ago, would say, well, I hope so. Because it's a works-based system, and you never are quite sure if you've done enough. I try to live a good life. I try to obey the commandments. I try to, do the ordinances. I try to do all these things. But and God is loving. So, we would say, well, wow, I'm a Christian, and I know with certainty right now. I know this from passages in 1 John. I know this from the Gospels, and you have those places where you can talk about that. Christianity is not about your works. It's about what Jesus did for you. So the moment you accept the offer of Jesus' works, Jesus' work on the cross, you're in right now. You can know that right. You can have peace. This is the only system, by the way, in which you can know today with that kind of confidence.
Right.
And wouldn't you rather have that? Wouldn't you want to know this is true? Now, I don't even know if today, as much as Mormonism is morphing due to the pressures that are on it, if a Mormon would actually answer the way they would have 15 years ago. And it was very consistent, but when I was first starting this process, that Mormons would say, I don't know, but I sure hope so. That, would you be in heaven, celestial kingdom today with Heavenly Father? Right. So he wouldn't answer with certainty. And I think that your offer of certainty of salvation in Jesus is a good place to start. But look, if you ask this question, what do you think happens when you go to when you die? If they answer, whatever their answer is, the next question you might ask is, well, why do you think that's true? It's kind of this Columbo tactic, right? Like, what do you mean by that? And why do you think that's true? Because that's going to get back, Nancy, to the question is, can I trust Joseph for this view of heaven? Can I trust Joseph? And I would just ask that question. And if they come back with that thing, well, I read it and I prayed about it and I had this experience, I would say, well, gosh, Muslims read the Quran and they have experiences. Does it make the Quran true?
No.
I mean, if I have an experience, if I speak to the spirit of the universe and I have an experience the next day, does that mean that there's actually a spirit of the universe, which is, very kind of nondescript, that is actually governing the universe, and that's as far as I go? I mean, how would that alone differentiate any belief system on planet Earth? I've got friends, for example, who prayed for something as Christians, and they received it, and that convinced them that Christianity was true. And then Mormonism is false. But does that make Christianity? No, it turns out experiences have to be measured against claims that can be grounded and actually investigated. Because everyone can claim an experience, but not everyone can claim that they have the evidence that this is true. So that's the next kind of conversation I might have. But I want to point you, that's a lot to say in a short phone call, and I get all that. So I'm going online right now real quick. Well, I was telling these guys earlier that the only bad thing about being on a video as you're doing a radio show is that I can't look at my notes. I have to actually be seen typing this in. but I'm going to try to get this up before I close with you. A guy by the name of Eric Johnson. You type him into Amazon, Eric Johnson Mormonism. My keyboard, of course, when I have this camera on, will not allow me to type, so I can't even pull this up. But if you pull in Eric Johnson with the C, Eric Johnson, and look up Mormonism, he's written a book that I wrote a chapter in. A lot of us wrote a chapter in that book, in which it talks about evangelizing Mormons from a number of different strategies and different views. Some are historical, some are on the basis of experience, some are on the basis of just talking about theology. There's a number of different approaches. Mine, of course, my chapter is all about, well, look, here are the evidential reasons why I can't trust the Book of Mormon. And I simply go through all of them, starting with motive of Joseph, just all the different things that detectives look at when we form a case. That's the approach that I use to discover if Christianity was true. That's also the process that I use to examine Mormonism. So, of course, that's what I'm going to talk about in the book. But if that's not the way you're wired, if you're wired differently, well, then this book has got a chapter for you, I guarantee you. And I just wish I had the name of and of course, because I can't, I'm getting it now. So let me go to Eric Johnson before it lets me, and Mormon. Okay, and I'll get the book for you right now. I'm getting it. And hopefully we'll sharing the good news with Mormons. Practical strategies for getting the conversation started. So if you just look at that, sharing the good news with Mormons, practical strategies for getting the conversation started. Many chapters in that book, written by all kinds of different apologists, people you'll recognize, that you will actually be able to use to start conversations, and different approaches based on who you are. That make sense?
Yep, it does. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful. Luckily, my keyboard came up just in time to give it to you. Thanks so much, Nancy. I appreciate you calling.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, we've got now 3 minutes before we have a break here. 2 minutes maybe. So I'm not sure we're going to try to go to another call, but we'll wait until we get to the backside of that. Let me say a couple things more about Mormonism before we go to the break at the top of the hour that might be helpful to you. It is all about definitions, and one of the definitions that differs between Mormonism and Christianity is the idea of salvation, right? Like saved by grace. You might have a Mormon, and you would say to him, hey, I believe that you're saved by grace alone. Today, that Mormon might say to you, I agree. Well, you're saved no matter, it's not about your good works. It's only about what Jesus does for you. We agree. How can we? You know that this is a work-based system, but here's the difference. Under Mormonism, you're on the ground and God's in the celestial kingdom, and Jesus comes down and he gives you a ladder. Without Jesus giving you the ladder, you're not getting the celestial kingdom. But you have to climb the ladder in your own good works. So they can really say that without Jesus, it's all Jesus. Your good works won't get you alone. What? You have no ladder. You need a ladder. Jesus brings you the ladder. But that's not what Christian grace means, what Christian salvation is based on. Under Christianity, no. Jesus is going to drop down on a rope and tie it around you while you're kicking and screaming and completely unable to even climb the rope, and he's going to drag you up. That is the view of grace that's held by Christians. We have to be able to kind of understand the illustrations well enough to be able to differentiate between these two ideas that are using the same term. Because that view can say, well, yeah, it is all Jesus. Well, in that sense, yeah, in the sense that he's giving you the ladder, no climbing. But you still have to climb. And that is not the view of Christian grace. That being said, we're right up against the end of the hour. We'll take a break here. I'll come back and see you in the next hour. Remember to call us at 855-243-9975 or 562-424-8229 for the next hour here at Stand to Reason.